Welcome to Logic Over Faith. When people imagine eternal life, it often sounds like a dream. Never dying, never losing your loved ones, never worrying about sickness or the shortness of time. On the surface, it feels like a perfect solution to the greatest fear humans have, which is death. But if we stop and think carefully, the idea of eternal life, whether promised in religion or imagined in fantasies, is not a blessing. It is actually absurd, unrealistic, and deeply troubling once you unpack it. First, let's look at why eternal life is even desirable in the first place. Human beings are afraid of death because it means the end of our experiences, our thoughts, and our identity. Religion steps in and tries to solve this fear by offering immortality. You can live forever in heaven if you believe and obey, or you can be punished forever in hell if you don't. But here is the problem. Living forever sounds nice only when you compare it to dying. Once you actually imagine what eternity would mean, it becomes impossible to make sense of. Think about time. Our lives feel meaningful because they are limited. We value moments because we know they will not last forever. A meal with friends, a walk in the park, a child's laughter. These things matter because they are fleeting. If you stretch time endlessly, the meaning collapses. Imagine listening to your favorite song. Part of the beauty is that it begins and ends. If it played on repeat forever, it would stop being music and turn into noise. Eternal life is like forcing every song to play without end. What was once joyful becomes unbearable. Religions often describe heaven as a place of eternal happiness, but happiness itself depends on contrast. You cannot feel joy unless you have experienced sadness. You cannot appreciate comfort unless you know discomfort. If life is one endless line of bliss, then the very concept of happiness loses all sense. It becomes an endless flat line with no peaks or valleys. That is not paradise. That is monotony stretched across infinity. Philosophers have explored this idea for centuries. One of the clearest examples is the thought experiment by Bernard Williams in his essay, The Macropolis Case. He argued that immortality would eventually become unbearable because every possible experience would eventually be exhausted. Imagine trying every hobby, meeting every person, traveling to every corner of existence. Eventually, there would be nothing new left. Eternal life would trap you in an endless loop of boredom with no escape. Death, in a strange way, is what gives life its urgency and beauty. Religions rarely address this problem directly. They give vague descriptions like gardens of delight, mansions, rivers of milk and honey, or eternal union with a divine being. These are poetic images, but they avoid the reality that eternity is endless repetition. Even if heaven had unlimited pleasures, humans would eventually become numb to them. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. When you repeat a pleasurable experience enough times, your brain adjusts, and it no longer excites you. It becomes the new normal. If you ate your favorite dessert every day for eternity, it would eventually lose all flavor. Heaven, under this logic, collapses into boredom. Now consider the flip side: eternal punishment. The idea that someone could be tortured forever for finite actions on earth is one of the most disturbing concepts religion has ever created. Even in human justice systems, punishment is proportional. A thief might spend years in prison, a murderer might face life sentences, but no one argues for infinite punishment for finite crimes. Yet religions insist that a few decades of disbelief or moral mistakes deserve endless suffering. This is not just absurd, it is morally bankrupt. If eternal bliss makes no sense because happiness loses meaning, then eternal torture is even worse because it represents cruelty without end. Let's bring this down to real life. Imagine you are given a weekend holiday at the most luxurious resort in the world. Every comfort, every food, every view is perfect. For a few days it feels magical. But now imagine you cannot leave that resort ever again. No matter how beautiful it is, no matter how much you enjoy it at first, eventually you will feel trapped. Humans need change, contrast, and even challenges to feel alive. Without them, even paradise turns into a prison. Now extend that not for a lifetime, not for 1,000 years, but for eternity. That is the promise of heaven when taken literally. Another absurdity comes from the question of identity. If you live forever, do you remain the same person? If you change endlessly over infinite time, are you still you? Or do you eventually become something unrecognizable? Personal identity depends on memory and continuity, but in an infinite span of time, your memory could never hold everything. Either you forget most of it, which means you are no longer the same person, or you carry everything, which would be overwhelming. Eternal life threatens the very idea of personal identity, because the you who began the journey would disappear in the flood of infinite experience. Let us also think about relationships. Part of what makes love special is the fear of losing it. The bond between parent and child, friends or partners, is intensified by the awareness that time is short. Now imagine eternal life where nobody ever leaves. Does that bond remain meaningful? Or does it flatten out because there is no urgency, no risk, no possibility of loss? Would you really feel the same about someone if you knew you would have trillions of years together with no end? The preciousness of love is tied to its fragility. Take fragility away, and love becomes just another endless routine. We also have to consider how eternal life clashes with what we know from science. Biology is built on cycles. Birth, growth, decay, and death are natural processes that keep ecosystems balanced. If nothing died, there would be no renewal. Forests would choke, populations would explode, and life would stagnate. Death is not a flaw in the system. It is part of what makes the system thrive. So when religions present eternal life as perfection, they actually propose a state that contradicts the natural order entirely. It would not be life anymore. It would be something unnatural, frozen, and ultimately absurd. There is also the issue of fairness. Religions often say eternal life is a reward for belief, but belief is not something people can always control. People are shaped by culture, upbringing, education, and experiences. A child born into one religion is told that their way is the truth, while another child born across the world hears a completely different story. To say that eternal life or eternal punishment depends on which set of stories you happen to believe is absurdly unfair. It reduces eternity to a lottery of birthplace. Furthermore, the human brain struggles to even imagine eternity. Try counting to 1 billion. You cannot. Try to picture infinity. It has no end, no boundary, no measure. Yet religions ask us to accept this concept as if it were natural. Our finite minds can barely handle decades, let alone eternity. This mismatch between our limited capacities and the concept of eternal existence shows how unrealistic it truly is. And then there is the paradox of desire. Many people think they want eternal life because they fear death. But if eternal life were offered right now, most of us would eventually regret it. Studies in psychology show that when people imagine extreme longevity, not even eternity, just thousands of years, they expect it would lead to exhaustion, detachment, and loss of meaning. Death, while frightening, gives life structure. Knowing there is an end encourages us to make choices, to prioritize, to love deeply. Without that end, choices lose urgency. Everything can be postponed indefinitely, and in that endless postponement, nothing feels important anymore. Religious texts try to paint eternity as desirable by using human pleasures as metaphors: gardens, food, companionship, and rest. But these are all human desires tied to human bodies. In eternity, what would a body even mean? Would you eat without hunger? Would you drink without thirst? Would you rest without fatigue? Once those needs are removed, the pleasures attached to them vanish. Eating endlessly without hunger is not a pleasure. It is absurd. Some believers argue that heaven is not about material pleasures, but about being in the presence of God forever. Yet even here, the absurdity remains. The human mind is wired for variety, change, and novelty. Worship without end, praise without break, adoration without variety. This is not joy. This is monotony disguised as devotion. Even the most devout people on earth take breaks from prayer. They eat, sleep, talk, and do ordinary things. A heaven of endless worship would be unlivable. If eternal life is absurd as bliss and horrifying as punishment, then why do religions cling to it? The answer is simple. Eternal life solves a psychological problem, not a logical one. People are terrified of death, and eternal life promises comfort. It does not matter if it makes sense. It only matters that it soothes. But comfort built on an absurd idea does not make it true. It is like promising a thirsty man that he will get water from a mirage. It may calm him temporarily, but the water never arrives. Eternal life, once examined closely, collapses under its own weight. It fails to provide meaning. It contradicts human psychology. It undermines identity. It erases love. It ignores the natural order. And it insults fairness. Death may feel harsh, but it is death that gives life shape and meaning. If we lived forever, nothing would matter. Because it ends, everything matters. One of the strongest illusions around eternal life is that people imagine themselves remaining as they are now. Healthy, young, full of energy. But this is already impossible. If eternal life meant carrying your current body forever, then you would eventually suffer from decay, aging, or disease. That would not be heaven but eternal hospital visits. If, on the other hand, you are given a new, indestructible body, then it is no longer you in the same sense. Your current body is part of your identity. Replacing it with something completely different is like replacing a ship plank by plank until nothing original is left. At what point do you stop being yourself? The promise of eternal life undermines the very self it is supposed to preserve. Memory is another problem. Imagine living for 1,000,000 years. How many birthdays would you remember? How many conversations? How many books, meals, or faces would stay with you? Your memory cannot stretch infinitely. If eternal life requires you to keep forgetting old experiences just to make room for new ones, then your identity is constantly dissolving. You are not the same person who started the journey. And if by some miracle you did retain all memories, the weight of carrying trillions of experiences would crush your sense of self. Life would become an unbearable flood of recollection. There is also a hidden cruelty in the religious version of eternal life. If heaven and hell exist, then people are permanently separated. Families are divided forever. A mother in heaven must accept that her son is in hell. A husband must accept that his wife is burning without end. What kind of paradise is that? The idea that you can enjoy eternal happiness while knowing others suffer eternal torture makes no sense psychologically. Either you stop caring about those you once loved, which makes you less human, or your happiness is permanently poisoned by guilt. Neither option looks like heaven. Consider also the question of motivation. Right now, we study, work, create, and explore because time is limited. Deadlines push us. Opportunities slip away if we hesitate. But in eternal life, there is no urgency. You can always do it tomorrow, or in 1,000 years, or in 1,000,000,000,000 years. Without deadlines, without scarcity, motivation collapses. Why paint a picture now if you can paint it later? Why learn an instrument today if you can learn it across the span of infinity? Eventually, every choice becomes meaningless because every option is endlessly available. Eternal life paralyzes rather than frees. Let's take a simple, real-world example. Think about television shows. The ones we love most are the ones that have an ending. They tell a story, reach a conclusion, and leave us with closure. Shows that drag on for too many seasons often lose their charm. Characters repeat themselves, plots stretch thin, and viewers lose interest. Life is not so different. It is compelling because it has a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Stretch it into endless episodes with no conclusion, and the beauty fades into absurd repetition. Now let us imagine boredom on an eternal scale. If you live forever, eventually you will try everything. Travel every world, taste every food, learn every language. After millions of years, nothing will surprise you. Novelty would die. The brain is wired for stimulation through change, but eternity guarantees the end of novelty. You would find yourself longing for an end, a final act, some closure. And here lies the ultimate paradox. Eternal life, promised as a cure for death, ends up making death itself desirable. Some people try to escape this problem by imagining that heaven constantly renews interest. They say, God will always create something new, so we will never be bored. But think about that. You are admitting that human psychology requires limits, contrast, and change in order to function. Without those, eternal life collapses. If you constantly need artificial novelty to stay engaged, then heaven is not truly eternal bliss. It is an eternal distraction machine. constantly feeding you diversions to prevent you from noticing how empty the idea actually is. Another issue lies in morality. Eternal life cheapens moral choices. If you have forever to make things right, what urgency do you have to act now? If eternity is waiting, then mistakes can always be fixed later. Real morality requires stakes. It requires the possibility that your actions matter here and now. Eternity dilutes responsibility by stretching it across infinite time.
Even the concept of eternal reward itself feels childish when you compare it with real human values. Imagine giving a student endless candy because they passed one test, or punishing them with endless beatings because they failed. This would not be justice. It would be absurd excess. Yet religions tell us that eternal life works in exactly this way. Limitless reward or limitless punishment for finite behavior. Such a system would be laughed out of any human court. But when placed in a divine context, people accept it without question.
Think also about the sheer impossibility of eternity fitting into human desires. Right now, we cherish weekends and vacations because they are short. A holiday that never ends would stop being a holiday. The same food, the same view, the same beach would eventually feel dull. Eternal life promises exactly this, a holiday without end, which is no longer a holiday at all. Philosophically, the absurdity runs deeper. If time stretches without end, then no moment in eternity is ever special. Any given event is swallowed up by an infinite number of others. In an infinite span, your happiest memory is just one dot lost among countless others. Even your worst suffering in hell becomes insignificant against eternity, yet paradoxically it never ends. Infinity makes every individual moment meaningless because no moment stands out. Some might argue that heaven is beyond human comprehension, that it cannot be compared to earthly experiences. But this is a convenient escape. If eternal life cannot be understood in human terms, then why describe it in human terms at all? Why use gardens, food, thrones, or music? Religions do this because they must appeal to our imagination. But once you dig into the logic, it falls apart. If eternal life cannot be described without contradiction, then it is not an idea worth taking seriously. And here is another strange contradiction. Religious people often criticize materialism, saying that worldly pleasures are shallow. Yet their vision of eternity is often nothing more than exaggerated materialism. Richer mansions, endless feasts, permanent youth, unending comfort. If material pleasures are shallow on earth, why would they suddenly become meaningful when stretched into infinity? The inconsistency is striking. On the other hand, if eternal life is purely spiritual, then what do you even do? Floating as a soul forever, detached from hunger, thirst, and need, sounds less like joy and more like emptiness. Without desires to fulfill, existence becomes a blank stare across endless time. Eternal life as a spirit is not paradise either. It is eternal nothingness, dressed up in religious poetry. This brings us back to the heart of the issue. Human life is precious not because it is infinite, but because it is finite. Death is not a flaw, but a frame. Like the frame around a painting, it gives life boundaries that allow us to appreciate what is inside. Without the frame, the painting stretches endlessly until it loses shape. Eternal life is like removing the frame. It destroys the very picture it is supposed to preserve. There is also the question of desire itself. Desires exist because we lack something. Hunger makes food valuable. Thirst makes water precious. Loneliness makes companionship sweet. In eternal life, where all desires are endlessly fulfilled, desire itself disappears. Without desire, there is no joy, no striving, no meaning. Eternal life cancels out the very conditions that make life worth living. This is why many thinkers, both ancient and modern, have argued that death is not the enemy we think it is. Epicurus, the Greek philosopher, said it simply: death is nothing to us, because when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we no longer exist. He understood that fearing death pushes us toward absurd solutions like eternal life. But once you accept death as natural, you can focus on living fully in the time you have. Modern psychology agrees. Studies show that people who accept mortality often live with more purpose. They cherish relationships more, they make bolder choices, and they find greater satisfaction in small joys. People who chase immortality often feel anxious, restless, or disconnected. Death, ironically, is what makes us truly alive. So when religions promise eternal life as a solution, they are selling an illusion. It is a story meant to calm fear, not a logical or desirable reality. It may comfort those who cannot face the thought of an ending, but comfort is not the same as truth. And if you examine it honestly, eternal life is not comfort at all. It is absurdity stretched across infinite time. In the end, what makes our lives meaningful is not that they never end, but that they do. The laughter of a child, the warmth of friendship, the excitement of learning, the beauty of art, all of these shine brighter because they are temporary. Knowing they will fade makes us treasure them now. Eternal life would strip that treasure away, leaving behind only monotony. Life is precious because it is short, and that is not a tragedy. That is the very thing that makes it beautiful.
Imagine waking up one ordinary morning and feeling, with the clarity of a cold wind, that the life you assumed was yours is actually a carefully assembled performance. Not a secret plot stitched in dark rooms, but a system fashioned in broad daylight. Taught to you, repeated to you, accepted by you. It isn't loud. It whispers. It slips into language, into rules, into those tiny approvals and corrections that accumulate until they form a script. What the most dangerous lies in a scandal or a headline, but a soft narrative so familiar it passes as common sense? What if the story you live by has been edited by hundreds of invisible hands over generations, until you can no longer tell where your voice ends and the chorus begins? From the first sound you imitate, you are steeped in norms. Parents, teachers, friends, and strangers hand you a map of what counts as success, love, decency, or shame. These maps are useful. They help societies function, but they are also blueprints for control. Early on, you learn to accept praise when you follow the path and to shrink when you diverge. You are rewarded for compliance. You are corrected for curiosity. The mechanisms are not mystical. They're painfully ordinary. Behavioral psychology shows how repeated reinforcement shapes habit and then identity. The classroom, the workplace, the church, the feed on your phone. Each is a training ground where small approvals and quiet scorn accumulate into habits of thought. And it works. People build lives around these stamps. Careers are chosen to match expectations. Romances are measured against cultural ideals. Even private griefs are reshaped into socially acceptable stories. When you accept validation as a currency of value, you begin to measure yourself by external criteria. Your worth becomes a ledger of approvals. Who sets the exchange rate? Who decides which behaviors earn praise and which invite scorn? The answer is not one villain. It is a network. Institutions, industries, media, families, each nudging you toward predictable roles. Over time, the pressure to conform grows less like an outside shove and more like an internal compass needle that points to normal. This is where the big deception takes hold. It tells you your value depends on how well you fit the system, and that your success equals your productivity. It nudges you to equate worth with output, appearance, and possessions. Billboards, curricula, and glossy feeds all chant the same refrain. If your life doesn't match the billboard, you tighten the screws. If your inner voice suggests a different path, you silence it. Not always because someone shouted, but because you learn to be afraid of being the odd one out. Rejection, ridicule, and obscurity become threats more terrifying than slow erosion of your sense of self. And so you tuck away discomfort. You learn to perform the part you were handed. Have you ever felt like an actor reading lines that don't belong to you? Chasing goals that were picked for you? That hollow ache underachievement. It isn't moral failing. It's proof of mismatch. Society is adept at turning dissatisfaction inward, convincing you that the fault lies within. You're not trying hard enough, not positive enough, not disciplined enough. Distress becomes a personal flaw rather than a signal that the system might be misaligned with your nature. This diversion is brilliant in its cruelty because it keeps the focus on self-improvement rather than systemic correction. You're busy fixing yourself while the structure that shaped you remains intact. And yet, the lie succeeds because it wears the clothes of truth. It looks like culture. It smells like tradition. It masquerades as safety. That is what gives it power and makes it so difficult to dismantle. But escape isn't impossible. Understanding the architecture of the system is the first move toward reclaiming autonomy. We don't need to invent rebellion. We need to remember that our minds can be awakened. The first step is recognizing that many of the signals you obey were not built for your flourishing, but for the smooth running of a predictable machine. Think for a moment about the role of stories. From bedtime tales to blockbuster films, stories are how people make sense of the world. Repeat a story often enough and it becomes a lens through which every new fact is interpreted. Consider the myth of meritocracy, the notion that hard work straightforwardly yields success. On its face, it's a heroic tale that encourages effort. Beneath the surface, however, it acts as a moral explanation for inequality. If some fail, they must have failed themselves. This story comforts those on top and disciplines those below. It personalizes structural failure into individual deficiency and discourages questions about access, inheritance, or unfair systems. Then there's technology, which amplifies the same dynamic. Mass media once synchronized millions around shared images and ideas. Today, algorithms customize influence by the pixel and the scroll. The platforms that promise connection teach you what to long for by curating desires into neat, clickable packages. Genuine individuality is monetized. Be Yourself sells best when yourself follows recognizable patterns that can be packaged and bought. Even rebellion becomes consumable aesthetic. Dress like an icon of dissent, share a ready-made slogan, and the industry will happily sell you back the image of independence. The result is a culture where the illusion of choice replaces the messy, terrifying work of real freedom. Words matter too. Language shapes thought. When terms are softened or sanitized, resistance becomes harder to imagine. Euphemisms replace sharp realities, so that critique loses its edge. Corporations and politicians often swap blunt truths for gentle labels, collateral damage for civilian death, restructuring for mass layoffs, and the consequence is that publics grow less outraged and more numb. This is not an accident. Streamline language for text systems by shrinking the space where dissent can take hold. If the vocabulary for dissent is whittled down, the capacity to imagine a different world is similarly diminished. But perhaps the most profound shift occurs inside you. Over years of external conditioning, you begin to police your own mind. Self-censorship is the internal mirror of social control. You quiet the instincts that might reveal an alternative life. Dreams are postponed, then diluted, then eventually forgotten. You teach yourself obedience so skillfully that freedom feels risky and disorderly. The most effective prison is the one with no bars, only habits, assumptions, and the polite voice that says, "That's not for people like us." When you internalize limits, you become both the inmate and the warden. So what breaks the spell? Not force, not sudden renunciation. Liberation starts with asking simple, stubborn questions. Whose life am I living? Which parts of my desire come from me, and which are handed to me? What would I choose if approval were relevant? Awareness is a first step, because the mind that knows its conditioning can also unlearn it. The key is not to reject society wholesale, but to reclaim the parts of yourself that have been ceded to convenience, fear, or habit. Reclamation begins with naming the stories that rule you and tracing them back to their makers. We are not fixed. Psychology tells us the mind is plastic. We can change patterns we inherited. But change requires intention. It asks for courage more than certainty. It demands honest inventory. Which beliefs are mine and which were purchased for me by others? Which fears belong to my story and which were grafted onto me by the culture around me? When you begin to answer, you create space to rewrite. You free desire from its consumer script and align your identity with inner truth rather than social imprimatur. This is not theoretical. In daily life, reclaiming your mind looks like small acts that accumulate, deciding on a metric of success that you define, treating fear as a signal, not an order, letting your curiosity lead even when it unsettles others, It means refusing the neat boxes offered by Resume and Roll, and instead listening to the strange, persistent whisper that has always been yours. It is a process of reclamation of mind, desire, identity, and then action. Choosing a life that reflects those reclaimed priorities, even when the chorus grows loud in protest. The greatest lie ever sold is the story you learn about your limits. The antidote is a steadfast insistence that you are not fixed, that you are not owned by expectation, and that authenticity is a practice rather than a one-time event. To walk out of the theater of other people's scripts, you must first recognize the stage. Once you can see the ropes and pulleys, they lose their magic. Awareness gives you a choice. You can continue to perform according to received instructions, or you can begin to rewrite the script line by line, claim small freedoms and expand them. If something in you stirred while you listened to this, follow that stir. It might be memory, a recollection of what you once loved before being taught to want something else. Or it might be a question that refuses easy answers. Either way, keep listening. The path ahead isn't tidy. It asks for patience with setbacks and stubbornness in the face of small humiliations, but it is available to anyone willing to look and begin to choose now. Centuries ago, control was simple. Kings and emperors wielded power with swords. Priests claimed authority through divine decree, and disobedience could mean punishment or death. The lines were sharp, the consequences immediate. Fear ruled openly. But over time, rulers discovered that chains and threats, though effective, were crude. Far more efficient was a softer method, convincing people that the rules served them, that the order imposed was natural, inevitable, even righteous. Control shifted from the battlefield into the mind. Plato foresaw this in his allegory of the cave. Prisoners shackled in darkness, mistaking flickering shadows for reality. If one broke free and glimpsed a light, he was scorned or attacked by those still chained. Why? Because comfort in the familiar is more persuasive than truth. This is a genius of subtle control. Once the story is accepted, people defend it against anyone who challenges it. Society itself becomes the enforcer. The instruments of influence have always been stories. Religions told stories of salvation and damnation. Nations crafted myths of destiny and glory. Families repeated tales of honor and shame. Stories shaped morality, behavior, and belonging. To believe the story was to be safe. To reject it was to risk exile. Over generations, these stories hardened into culture, law, and common sense. What began as narrative became invisible architecture. Consider the story of meritocracy. It says, if you work hard, you will succeed. This idea sounds empowering, even fair. Yet beneath the surface, it disguises inequality. When someone struggles, the story implies the fault is theirs, not the system, not privilege, not structural barriers. By repeating this tale, society justifies disparity while absolving itself of responsibility. The myth comforts winners and silences losers, keeping both loyal to the system. Political thinker Noam Chomsky observed how modern media sustains this framework. The trick isn't in fabricating outright lies, but in shaping the range of thought. You are not told what to believe directly. Instead, the boundaries of acceptable questions are set for you. The unaskable remains invisible. In this way, the system doesn't need to crush dissent. It prevents it from being conceived in the first place. Then came the screen, first television, then the internet, now the algorithm. Never before billions absorbed the same stories at once, repeated in pixels and sound bites until they echo in our private thoughts. Media doesn't simply reflect culture, it manufactures it. Celebrities beam curated lives into your imagination. Influencers present scripted authenticity, and feeds deliver ideals in endless scrolls. You don't just consume entertainment. You consume models of desire, what to look like, how to live, who to become. Have you ever caught yourself comparing your messy, human life to a feed of polished moments and wondering, why not me? That feeling is not an accident. It is design. It is programming. The same system that shows you what you want also sells you the tools to chase it. Products, lifestyles, even personalities. Rebellion itself gets commodified. Be a free thinker by buying the shirt. Join the movement by posting the hashtag. Even dissent is folded neatly into market categories. Psychologist Carl Jung wrote about the collective unconscious, a deep reservoir of shared symbols and archetypes. Today, those same archetypes, hero, rebel, lover, sage, are packaged into movies, campaigns, and brands. The sacred desire for purpose and belonging becomes a marketing pitch. Spirituality becomes logo. Activism becomes merchandise. Uniqueness becomes trend. The result is a world where freedom of choice feels abundant, but real freedom, the kind that risks social disapproval, is quietly discouraged. Even language becomes a tool of control. George Orwell warned of this in 1984, where stripped-down vocabulary, you speak, eliminated words for rebellion. If you cannot say it, you cannot imagine it. In our world, the language is not so blunt, but no less powerful. Civilian deaths are called collateral damage. Mass layoffs are downsizing. Surveillance is data collection. When protest erupts, participants are branded as radicals, extremists, or unstable. Words reshape perception. A softened term dulls outrage. A loaded label delegitimizes dissent. Over time, this conditioning sinks so deep that you no longer need external guards. You become your own censor. You stop yourself from speaking the inconvenient thought, from entertaining the forbidden dream, from asking the dangerous question. You tell yourself, that's not realistic, or that's not how things are done. The control has been internalized. The invisible hand doesn't push you. It whispers and you obey. This is why the most profound prison is internal. Once you've absorbed society's definitions, you don't just follow rules. You police yourself, sometimes more harshly than any authority would. You dismiss your yearnings before they take shape. You shrink your imagination to fit the box marked normal. And in doing so, you surrender without realizing you've given anything up. Normality itself is a construct. What counts as acceptable shifts with time and place. But because it feels stable, people cling to it. To be normal is to be safe. To deviate is to risk shame, ridicule, or exile. And so most people comply. Yet inside, the whisper persists, a faint tug towards something truer, something freer. That voice is not madness. It is memory. It is the self before conditioning. The spark that remembers who you are beyond performance. The question is whether you will listen. Breaking free begins not with rebellion against society, but with reclamation of your own mind. Ask, whose values am I living by? Which desires are mine and which were planted? What fears are truly protective and which are cages? These questions do not dismantle the system overnight, but they loosen the grip. They reveal the strings. Once you see them, obedience feels less like fate and more like choice. You are not fixed. You are not a sum of your roles, your possessions, or your status. You are not defined by the lines someone else wrote. Your identity is not static. It is fluid, evolving, expansive. The lie wants you to believe you are confined, that your worth is conditional, that you must prove yourself through productivity and conformity. The truth is that you are already whole. Existence precedes essence. As Sartre said, you define your life, not the system. But to live this truth requires courage. It means embracing discomfort, risking disapproval, tolerating uncertainty. It means rewriting your story one choice at a time, even when the world insists you stick to the script. Liberation is not rejecting society entirely. It is refusing to let society define your essence. It is choosing alignment with your deepest values rather than the loudest voices. Awareness is step 1. Reclamation is step 2. Action is step 3. Awareness exposes illusion. Reclamation restores your inner compass, and action transforms your life into one authored by you. This is how you break free from the greatest lie ever sold. By refusing to measure your worth by standards designed to keep you obedient. By reclaiming your desires, your fears, and your identity as yours alone. The path is open. The question is whether you will walk it. The system wants you docile, obedient, endlessly chasing approval. But you are not small. You are not confined. You are limitless. The moment you see beyond the veil, you cannot unsee it. And that is the beginning of freedom. Every great deception has one final layer, distraction. The system understands that if you stare too long at the emptiness behind its promises, you will start to question. So it keeps you occupied. with work that consumes your hours, with entertainment that consumes your attention, with endless noise that leaves no silence for reflection. When was the last time you sat in stillness without reaching for a device, without filling the moment with someone else's words or images? That restless urge is not weakness. It is conditioning. You have been trained to fear silence, because silence is where truth begins to emerge. The Romans called it bread in circuses. Feed the people, entertain them, and they will not rebel. Today, the bread is cheap convenience, and the circus is digital spectacle. Sports, celebrity scandals, viral dances, political outrage, all engineered to keep the collective gaze diverted. The more trivial the distraction, the safer the system remains. What better way to prevent rebellion than to keep people endlessly busy chasing illusions that feel urgent but matter little? But distraction is not just external. It seeps inside. It teaches you to chase validation rather than purpose. How many likes? How many followers? How many views? A currency of attention replaces genuine connection. You begin to measure your worth not by the depth of your relationships or the truth of your character, but by metrics that can be counted and compared. And because these numbers never stop, your hunger never ends. The system doesn't need to chain you. You chain yourself with craving. Philosopher Eric warned of this trap when he distinguished between being and having. To be is to exist authentically. To have is to define yourself by possessions, titles, and achievements. Modern culture glorifies having. Own more, achieve more, display more. Yet no amount of having can satisfy the hunger for being. The more you pursue the external, the more hollow the internal becomes. And in that hollowness, the system thrives. A restless soul is easy to manipulate. Here lies the brilliance of the greatest lie ever sold. It doesn't just enslave you materially. It enslaves you spiritually. It convinces you that your salvation lies in the very system that drains you. Feel lonely? By connection through apps. Feel inadequate? By confidence through products. Feel powerless? By influence through status. Each purchase deepens the illusion. Each cycle leaves you emptier than before, yet still believing the cure is just one step away. But cracks appear. Always cracks appear. No matter how polished the illusion, reality presses through. You see a successful figure admit to despair. You achieve the milestone you thought would bring peace and find a hollow. You realize the approval you chase feels shallow the moment you receive it. These cracks are not failures. They are openings. They are invitations to step outside the script. And stepping outside does not mean abandoning life. It means reclaiming it. It means learning to sit with silence and hear your own thoughts again. It means questioning every should you inherited and asking whether it aligns with who you are. It means shifting from performance to presence, from conformity to authenticity. Freedom is not in escaping society, but in refusing to let it dictate your essence. But freedom has a cost. It will unsettle those around you. People invested in the illusion will resist your awakening. They may ridicule, dismiss, or even attack you. Remember Plato's cave. The freed prisoner who saw the sun was hated by those still staring at shadows. To question the lie threatens not just the system, but the comfort of those who depend on it. They would rather defend their chains and face uncertainty. Do not mistake their hostility for truth. It is fear disguised as certainty. History shows us that true freedom often begins as loneliness. Mystics, rebels, philosophers all faced isolation before their vision spread. What feels like exile is often the birth of independence. And when you stand firm, you become a beacon. Others who sense the cracks but fear the leap may see in you the proof that life beyond the illusion is possible. Liberation is contagious. So how do you live beyond the lie? Not by grand gestures, but by small, deliberate acts of reclamation. Say no when the script demands yes. Choose rest over relentless productivity. Speak truth even when silence would be safer. Create without needing validation. Connect without needing transaction. Each act weakens the lie's hold. Each step restores your authorship of your own existence. Remember, the lie thrives on your forgetfulness. It survives only if you remain unaware. But once you see it, once you recognize the patterns of control, distraction, and conditioning, its power falters. You cannot unsee what has been revealed. That is why awareness is the ultimate rebellion. To awaken is to reclaim the right to define reality for yourself. And so the greatest lie ever sold is this, that you are small, dependent, incomplete without the system. The truth is the opposite. You are vast, capable of meaning that no system can contain. You are whole, even in imperfection. You are free, even in a world that prefers you obedient. The system does not grant you worth. You carry it innately. The choice is yours. You can remain in the cave, defending shadows, policing your own chains. Or you can turn, face the blinding light, and step into the unknown. It will not be easy. It will not be comfortable. But it will be real. And in that reality lies the freedom no story, no ruler, no system can ever take from you. This is the beginning of your rebellion, not against the world, but against the illusion, against the greatest lie ever sold.